of who that there's something who Jesus is, or something special about him. And then in verse 14 of this same chapter, we see Jesus teaching Nicodemus who he really is. So in John 3 and verse 14, it says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness." Now, you guys, I don't think have been taught that story yet in Sunday school or junior church, have you? You know who Moses is? The parting of the Red Sea, let my people go, all of that kind of, okay, that was Moses. So Moses, there's a story in the Old Testament where Moses had to do something special because God's people did something that made God upset with them. So he sent fiery serpents to bite the people. And when they bit the people, they got sick. And so Moses went and prayed to God to have God help him heal the people from this sickness. And God said, "I want you to make a brass serpent wrapped around a pole." So it was like a statue, kind of. It wasn't an actual snake. And he said, "I want you to lift it up, and all the sick people that look at that brass serpent wrapped around that pole will be healed, like a miracle." And that's what he did, and they were all healed. Yes, ma'am.
And do you know that that's the symbol the physicians use?
It is. That's true. Yep. Yep. The serpent wrapped around the pole. Yep. I'm pretty sure that's where that's come from.
Yeah.
In the same way that the dove is a symbol of peace because of the story of Noah, that kind of thing. So a lot of biblical symbolism in our culture, sort of infused in that. But yeah, so that's what Jesus is talking about, the serpent wrapped around the pole. So he says, "As Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so too, even so must the Son of Man, Jesus, be lifted up." So not literally lifted up. They're not going to pick Jesus up and hold him in the air. You know? What they mean is, if we'll elevate Jesus, we'll talk about him, we'll treat him special in our lives, and we'll let people know about Jesus, then everybody who looks to him to be saved from their sins and to be able to go to heaven, they will be able to go to heaven and be saved. So that's what Jesus is trying to teach Nicodemus here, is everybody who looks to Jesus for salvation will be saved in the same way that everybody who looked at that brass serpent was healed as well. So in verse 15 he says that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And then verse 16, we all know, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life." But how many without looking can quote verse 17? Which says, "For God sent not his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." Which is an important part to add to verse 16. Because God loved the world, gave his Son for it, but it's also directly connected to the fact that God is not interested in condemnation, he's interested in salvation. And that Jesus was sent into the world to offer salvation to the world. So this is what Nicodemus is learning for the first time. And even Jesus mentions this. And he says, "Art thou a ruler of God's people, and knowest thou not these things?" That they should have known this first and foremost, and yet Jesus is taking one of the chief leaders and teachers of Israel and having to go back and teach him about what the Messiah is, what the Christ is, and why he's coming. Right? So just like a child learning this for the first time, so too is Nicodemus learning this for the first time. And then if we'll jump forward to chapter 19 of the book of John. Chapter 19 and verse 38. Which says, "And after this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, besought Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate gave him leave. He came therefore and took the body of Jesus. And there came also Nicodemus, which at the first came to Jesus by night." So we know it's not a different Nicodemus. "And brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, and 100 pound weight." Myrrh, We've heard that word before, haven't we?
Mhm.
The Christmas story. Christmas and Easter connected here by way of myrrh. And one of those gifts that the three wise men brought of gold and frankincense and myrrh. Then they took the body of Jesus and wound it in linen clothes with the spices, as the manner of Jews is to bury. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new sepulchre, wherein was never man yet laid. There laid they Jesus, therefore, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand, a borrowed tomb. And Nicodemus, coming with Joseph of Arimathea to prepare Jesus' body for burial. So the story of Nicodemus is quite unique and is unique to the book of John. No other gospel tells the story of Nicodemus. And they say, while Matthew was written with the Jews in mind, and that makes sense because as you read through the book of Matthew, there are a ton of Old Testament references. He's quoting Old Testament prophets and stories that took place in the Old Testament. It's written for those people that already knew the Old Testament really, really well, which would be the Jews, right? So Matthew is trying to make the case for Christ. He's trying to convince the Jews, this is your Messiah. This is your Christ. Trust him for salvation, right? While John is more a book of the gospel story to the whole world, right? And it's not just for one specific people group. The book of Mark was written more for the Romans in mind. It's a very action-packed book. It starts with John the Baptist, and there's 16 chapters, shortest of all the Gospels, runs right through to the crucifixion, the resurrection, and so forth. The book of John is written to make a case to the world, because we're talking to people, and remember, the whole world doesn't know the Bible like it does today, way back in these days. Right? So this story is not known. So when John is writing this, he's writing this so that it might go around the world. So that's why it starts in chapter 1 with, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the same was in the beginning with God. He's explaining the very beginnings, the not necessarily facts, but the concept of creation and Christ's part in creation specifically. So in the book of John, it's more of a picture of to the world. And he paints a picture with Nicodemus here of a man that went from being ashamed and embarrassed to meet with Jesus to one of the two men that prepared his body for the tomb. Because don't forget, this journey to the cross became a very lonely place. Right? He starts off and he's surrounded by people. He's at a dinner, right? And there's flocks of people when we started this Journey to the Cross series. And the alabaster box, and it's poured over his head and so forth. There's contention, and it begins to dwindle, right? Now we're losing Judas Iscariot a little bit, and the numbers are going away. We go from there to the Passover, right? We go to the upper room. The Lord gives the first Lord's Supper right there in that place. And he teaches them about it and instills it in the church. But then it's just him and the 12. Right? Judas is still there, but that is the moment where he leaves and goes to betray Jesus. So then we go from that place to the garden. So now it's gone from 12 disciples to 3 disciples. Are the only 3 there? And then when Jesus is arrested in the garden and carried into the high priest's house, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, we saw at the end of last week's lesson, it's just Peter. And he's following from a distance, so to avoid trouble. He's worried about being arrested. So Peter has gone through a lot. I think from when they first came to arrest Jesus, Peter drew his sword and attacked Malchus. Remember that. So he's gone from that to being afraid of being recognized as with Jesus for fear of being arrested. I think maybe Jesus scolding him a little bit there in the garden for attacking Malchus confused him a little bit. He's not sure what he's supposed to do, and that led him to a great amount of fear. But the further we get into this thing, the less crowded the cross is. It's not a very crowded place. There's not a lot of people there. So by the time Jesus is ready for burial, the fact that Nicodemus is one of the men that showed up to prepare him for burial is a tremendous sign of growth. So his story is one of a man who's gone from being a little embarrassed about being curious about Jesus to one that was so dedicated to him that he was one of the only two men there to prepare his body for burial. And it's a tremendous thing. Yes, ma'am.
So do you think Nicodemus was saved after all?
I do. I believe that. There's not any biblical proof, but in my personal opinion, there's not much greater proof. John 3:16, which tells us about salvation, it was literally taught to Nicodemus. And we know from the book of Galatians, which we talked about a little while, that there were some Pharisees in the days of the books of Acts that were trying to fuse their way of doing things with the church. So we know that there were some, at least former Pharisees in the church. That tells us. And I believe that Nicodemus had to be one of the first people to join the church when it started really gaining members in high numbers there in the book of Acts. Because as we see throughout the Bible, he was very quiet about his faith with Jesus, maybe even conflicted. But by the end of the gospel story, I think we can see very clearly he was not ashamed to be known as a Christian. So in my mind, he was probably one of the first ones to join the church after Jesus had ascended and spent that. There's 40 days he spent with the disciples between then and Acts chapter 2. So in my opinion, that's probably the way it worked out. So as we begin this story in the passion of the Lord, let's jump over to Matthew 26 now. In Matthew 26, we start our story with the high priest. You remember Jesus was being carried away at the end of our last lesson. And so now we're talking about Jesus at the high priest's house. They're standing before the high priest. And in verse 57, it says, "And they that lay hold on Jesus led him away to Caiaphas the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. But Peter followed him afar off unto the high priest's palace, and went in and sat with the servants to see the end. Now the chief priests and elders and all the council sought false witness against Jesus to put him to death. They were trying to get somebody to come forward and to just claim that Jesus had broken the law in some way so that they had some legal right to just go ahead and kill him. Now, we've talked about the mindset of these religious leaders before in the story with the alabaster box, because that story begins with the Pharisees and so forth, the scribes and the priests and so forth, trying to find a reason to murder Jesus. But they couldn't do it, not because of their own guilt of killing a person, let alone such a holy person as Jesus, but that they were afraid of the repercussions of the people and what the people would do to them. And we see that mindset hasn't changed all the way down here to Matthew 26. They're still only concerned with themselves. There's no concern at all with the other people or with doing the right or wrong thing. They don't care if they're doing the wrong thing, so long as it means that good things happen for them. And you can see how tremendous evil came out of such a simple mindset. You know, you can get bitter toward the world, and you can get bitter toward the things that happen to you in life. You know, you can allow the bad things that happen to you to harden your heart and to make you say, you know what? I don't care anymore. I just don't care. I've tried so hard for so long, and I just don't care anymore. I'm putting myself first because nobody else is going to, and I'm going to take care of me. And it's so easy to get there, folks. I wish I could tell you that it takes a lot, and it's really hard to do that. But there are certain moments in your life where that's an easy thing to do. You're not always like that. It's not always that tempting to just fall into evil that way, but there will be those moments where you're going to want to do that. And you have to learn to resist that temptation. We have to learn to put ourselves last, and that's why. Because when we get into the habit of thinking, how is this going to affect the people I care about? How is this going to affect other innocent people who didn't do anything wrong? And more importantly, because God has always been pretty faithful to us. Even when bad things happen, it's not his fault, like we like to think sometimes when we're upset. That's not his fault. And as a matter of fact, he's the only one sometimes there with us, comforting us and trying to help us through it. So remembering that he's been the best friend we ever had, also thinking, am I about to betray him the way that other people have betrayed me? We have to remember these things, and putting ourselves last puts us in that mindset. Because when you put yourself first, you forget a lot of things that you will remember when it's too late. Somebody gets hurt by the way you act, and then you remember, oh man, that's why I'm not supposed to do that way. And you remember too late. These high priests and so forth, they weren't interested in anybody but themselves. So they were looking for some false accusation against Jesus. Verse 60 says, but they found none. Can I tell you, they could have looked for an eternity and never found an accusation against Jesus? It's funny that when Jesus is preaching in Matthew 5, very early in this same book, he says, talking about when men shall revile you and shall persecute you and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake, he says. Because he's going through it here and knew he was going to go through it. And he says to you, when that happens, he says, rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven. And then he says, so persecuted they the prophets which were of old. So basically what he's telling you is, when these bad things happen to you, just understand you're in pretty good company. There were some pretty good men that went through the same thing you're going through. And now, when we read Matthew 26, we can see, hey, Jesus went through it too. That's some pretty good company as well, to be in the same company as Jesus. To say they did that to him too. That'll make us maybe feel a little better about things like that. He's being persecuted though. They're trying to lie about him. They found none, yea, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came 2 false witnesses. So everybody coming up and lying about Jesus, but evidently they weren't very good at lying, and did it in such a way where it was just not even believable. And people just laughing and shaking their heads, and then the priests going, okay, that's enough. You can go sit down now. So there came 2 false witnesses at the end, verse 61, and said, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days. So do we remember this quote? So for those of you who don't remember, Jesus is standing before the temple, and he's giving a bit of a lecture, and in the middle of that sermon, he's preaching, and he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I shall raise it up again. Somebody stands up and they said, how many years this temple was in building, and you shall destroy it and raise it again in 3 days? And it tells us there in the Bible, in brackets there, it says, but they understood not that he meant the temple of his body. Right? They did not understand he wasn't talking about the literal temple. He wasn't threatening to destroy the temple. He was talking about when he dies and is in the tomb for 3 days. Right? Can I tell you guys real quick? I'm going to get distracted for just a second. And I might be cutting ahead a little bit of my lesson, but I don't know that I'm going to get all the way through the lesson. So I'm going to go ahead and tell you now, Good Friday is a myth. Did you guys know that? Okay, for those of you who didn't know that, Jesus didn't die on Friday. Because the way we think it works is Friday, Saturday, Sunday, right? So the way that biblically and that time in Israel, the way that their days worked, they didn't run off 24-hour cycles like we do. They ran off of 2 12-hour cycles. That's why the Bible is written the way it does. It's 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. is one day. And then 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. the next day is one night. So 2 12-hour cycles instead of one 24-hour cycle. And that's the way it works. That's why in the book of Genesis, it says the evening and the morning were the first day, right? So it's the 2 12-hour cycles. You see that all throughout the Bible. So the way it breaks down is Jesus was on the cross on Wednesday. right? So he died. They prepared his body for burial. They put him in the tomb Thursday morning. So he's in the tomb for all day Thursday, all night, all day Friday, all night, all day Saturday, all night, and then 6 a.m. Sunday morning, he resurrected. So that's how that timetable works out. So he didn't actually die on Friday. He actually died Wednesday night, Wednesday evening, and they spent the rest of that time preparing him, Nicodemus, and the name has left my mind. We just read it.
Yeah.
In the book of John 19. I know the chapter. Oh, that's chapter 18. Okay, yeah, Joseph of Arimathea. So those two men preparing his body, and that's the way the timetables worked out. So Jesus actually died on Wednesday, not on Friday. Just a little interesting fact for you. Yeah.
Is it according to the Jewish religion that he had to be off the cross by 6 p.m. that night?
Well, that was because it was the Passover.
Right.
So yeah, so he had to be off the cross and put in the tomb by a certain time, or they'd be breaking laws because they're not supposed to be touching the dead on the day of the actual Passover. So they have a week. The Passover is a week, but then there's the actual one day of celebration, right? And that's the day where you read in the book of Exodus, and they have the Passover lamb and the whole thing, and it's the biggest day. It's the last day. So on that day, they're not supposed to touch anything unclean, which includes, like, obviously dead bodies and stuff like that. So yeah, there was a timetable. They had to have him in the tomb by. So that's how we know it was, exactly this time, and he was in the tomb for exactly that amount of time and so forth. So, yep, just an interesting little fact for you guys. They're still going to take the day off on Good Friday. I think I'm still going to let my kids not go to school that day, but right. I'm not going to make them stand outside a closed school building for 7 hours. I'm going to give you this book. You sit on the sidewalk. I'll see you in 7 hours. So he's standing before the high priest's house, and all of these things are happening. This witness comes up about the temple of God. It says, the high priest arose and said unto him, answerest thou nothing? What is it which these witness against thee? But Jesus held his peace. That means he didn't answer them at all. And the high priest, you say, well, is that because sometimes saying nothing at all is the best defense? That's not why. He didn't want a defense because he needed this to take him to the cross, right? He needed to get to that place so that he could die for our sins. So he answers nothing at all. And the high priest answered unto him, I adjure thee by the living God, that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus saith unto him, thou hast said. Nevertheless, I say unto you, hereafter ye shall see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven. That's a big statement. Now, that's easy to say in front of his 12 disciples, in front of all of these people that love him. He's standing before enemies, people that hate him, people that want him dead. And he looks them in the eye and he says, well, there's going to come a day you're going to bow the knee and you're going to confess the tongue like everybody else on planet Earth. You're going to see me sitting at the right hand of power. Is that what you mean? That's a hard thing to do in a room full of people that hate you. And yet, he still spoke the truth. And he mentions about himself, the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power. The right hand of power being sitting to the right, which is the position of, what is the word? The position of prestige, in other words, of great favor with the person sitting at the head of the table. The person sitting at the head of the table being God the Father. God the Son sitting at the right hand of God the Father, sitting, being the position the high priest, which Jesus is our high priest, is only able to do once his work is finished. You notice here he's still standing, defending himself, going to the cross. He's not done yet. Sitting on the right hand of the power and coming in the clouds of heaven, which is his ascension, we see. The clouds part and he departs into heaven, and then the angels they say to the people standing around, they say, why stand ye here gazing about? That he will return in like manner as he left. So the way he left is the way he's going to return. The clouds are going to part. He's going to open up from heaven. The sky is going to open up like a scroll. It's just going to open up in the sky. He's going to come out of that hole in the sky and return to us. Oh, so Jesus says all of this, and then verse 65, it says, then the high priest rent his clothes, saying, he hath spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses? So in other words, Jesus said it himself. So Jesus really needs to make it to the cross by a certain time. He's checking his watch, and these people are not getting it done on time. So he goes, yes, I'm the Son of God. I'll be sitting at the right hand of God the Father, and I'll be returning in the cloud of witnesses. Can we move this thing along, please? I've got 3 days to get there. So in verse 66, they say, what think ye? They answered and said, he is guilty of death. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him. You know what it means to buffet? That's what it is. You strike them with the open hand, the palm of the hand, and you just sort of hit them in a way where it doesn't leave as much of a mark. It's not really a slap. It's just kind of hitting with that bottom part of your hand, and it hurts really bad. Yeah, with one person does it. He's got a whole crowd hitting him right now. And others smote with the palms of their hands, so more of a slap. So he's getting it in all kinds of ways, leaving all kinds of marks on his body already. There are verses in the Old Testament which lead us to believe that this was the point in time they were also yanking out the hairs of his beard, ripping whole hunks of hair out of his beard before he even made it to Pilate. He's already suffering. We see this. This is the story where Peter denies the Lord. I don't have time to go into that story this morning because I'm probably already later behind than I want to be. What time is it right now? 10:30. Okay. I'm doing okay, but I've got to get through the whole cross in 15 minutes. So, yeah. So we don't have time to get into Peter, but it's a great story. Go check that out, the rest of the chapter of Matthew there. And when you understand the story of Peter here, when he denies the Lord, he leaves. The Bible says he weeps bitterly as he leaves. And when you get to that place later on in the Gospels where Peter says, I go a-fishing, they go back to those fishing boats. Then Jesus is on the shore waiting for them. Peter shows up, and him and Jesus aren't talking to each other. And Jesus starts addressing Peter directly. Right? He looks at him and says, Peter, look at me, Peter. Lovest thou me more than these? Do you love me more than the fish you gave me up for? And there's a whole conversation there. And that's why, and then you see like there's a reconciliation between Jesus and Peter before Jesus ascends into heaven, which is a beautiful thing to read. Because then in Acts chapter 2, that's where the confidence comes from. It's not overzealous Peter. It's not Peter, It's a learned Peter. It's a more confident Peter. It's not a fake confidence. It's a genuine confidence as he stands there in Acts chapter 2 and he begins to explain what's happening. You men of Galilee and all you thereabout, knowest therefore that these are not drunk as you suppose, seeing it is but the third hour, but this is which was spoken by the prophet Joel. And he begins to quote Joel there. And he looks, because a crowd is now gathered, and he looks at the high priest and those that brought Jesus to Pilate. And he points at them. And he says, and ye with wicked hands have crucified and have slain the Holy One of Israel. Wow. That's a transformation right there. It's a beautiful story Peter's got there. But Jesus continues his journey to the cross, and Peter's no longer following him. That cross has become a more lonely place. So let's look at Luke 23 real quick. Luke chapter 23. And verse 1 says, "And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king," which was just out and out a lie. Because what did Jesus say about paying tribute? Render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's. Render unto God the things which are God's. He pulls up a coin and he says, "Whose face is on this coin?" And they say it's Caesar's. And they say that's when he says, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's." Got his face on it. If he wants it, give it back to him. Right? That's what Jesus said. It applies perfectly to our money too. You pull up a dollar bill. Whose face is on that? George Washington. Render unto Washington the thing that are Washington's. Right? The Washington, if our government wants the back, it's got his face on it. Give it back to him. Right? Pay your taxes. So this is just an out and out lie they're telling about Jesus now. Verse 3, Pilate asked him, saying, "Art thou king of the Jews?" And he answered him and said, "Thou sayest it." So again, not really defending himself and being a little bit annoying to Pilate, but again, on purpose. He's trying to get to the cross on time. Then said Pilate to the chief priests and to the people, "I find no fault in this man." And again, he could have looked for an eternity and never found fault in Jesus. Then they were more fierce, saying, "He stirreth up the people, teaching through all Jewry, beginning from Galilee to this place." When Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked whether the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged unto Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was at Jerusalem at this time. So now Jesus is a bit of that political ping pong ball you've heard tell about. I don't want to deal with it. This is going to be a political nightmare. You deal with it. So he sends him to Herod. And we see Herod in verse 8 says, Herod saw Jesus. This is, by the way, a different Herod than the Herod you read about in the Christmas story, because Herod is not a person's name. I don't know if you knew that or not. Herod is not a person's name. It's a title, right? That was his title. That was his job title, was Herod. He was the Herod over the Jewish people. So this is a different person than what you read about in the Christmas story, but still not a fantastic human being as well. Power has a tendency to do that to people. But when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he was desirous to see him of a long season. Political people have a tendency to be that way about celebrities, because he had heard many things of him, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. So again, not really interested in the teachings of Jesus. He just wanted the magician to put on a show. Then he questioned him in many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod with his men of war set at naught and mocked him and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him again to Pilate. And the same day Pilate and Herod were made friends together, for before they were at enmity between themselves. Isn't that amazing? They were enemies before, then Jesus got involved, now there's peace. Isn't that interesting how that works out? It's almost like if you insert a little bit of Jesus into a situation, we can come out peaceful friends, right? I have seen men of like faith that carry the same kind of Bible, sing the same kind of songs, wear the same suits from the same tailors, and part their hair in the same way, walk away and say, "I can't be friends with you anymore." Now, not young men. Men old enough to know better. Men in their 60s and 70s. We can't fellowship anymore. I'll wash my hands of you. The problem? Men who know better should have remembered to insert a little bit of Jesus in there. Men who were told, "Brothers, let's stop and pray about this for a minute before we make a rash decision," and that man was completely ignored. And they continued on anyways. Insert a little bit of Jesus in the situation, there can be peace. So what we see between Pilate and Herod, and it's a tremendous thing. But then we see Jesus stand accused of being a heinous criminal back in Matthew 27. So we were in chapter 26. Now we're in chapter 27. Matthew 27 in verse 15. Can I get a time check?
39.
Okay, I've got 6 minutes. In verse 15, it says, "Now at the feast, the governor was wont to release unto the people a prisoner whom they would. And they had then a notable prisoner called Barabbas. Now, Barabbas was a murderer, a dangerous person, somebody you do not want on the streets. And Pilate here thought he found him a solution to his political problem, right? Because he knows that there's a lot of people that love Jesus, and if he does what this crowd is yelling at him to do, he's going to be putting to death an innocent man. So he found a solution to his political problem. Hey, it's that time of year. We pardon the turkey. Right? That's what we do in America. We don't pardon a prisoner. We pardon a turkey. It's a little weird, I know, but it's what we do. We do also pardon prisoners. Like at the end of a person's presidency, that's the last thing they do. You ever watched West Wing? It's a beautiful thing. But that's what he's doing here. We pardon one person. I'm going to give you here this heinous, vicious, murdering criminal who will put your families in danger. And on this side is Jesus. Now, which one of you do you want released back into society? He found the solution, he thought. But what ends up happening, so I find my place again, verse 18, he knew that for envy they had delivered him. When he was set down on the judgment seat, his wife sent unto him, saying, Have thou nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things this day in a dream because of him. But the chief priests and elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask Barabbas and destroy Jesus. So again, the chief priests now have gone further than having an innocent man killed. Now they have let a dangerous criminal loose among the people that will probably go about killing innocent people now because they so badly wanted Jesus tortured and killed. Such evil coming from something as simple as putting yourself first. It's a slippery slope you find yourself on. The governor answered and said unto them, Whether the twain will ye that I release unto you? They said, Barabbas. Pilate saith unto them, What shall I do then with Jesus, which is called Christ? They all said, Let him be crucified. Crucified, 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 crucified. They were chanting in that crowd about Jesus. And the governor said, Why? What evil hath he done? But they cried out the more, saying, Let him be crucified. So there's we see so much here. I'm trying to come through here for sake of time. When you look at this, you know what? Let's go ahead and jump ahead to John 19 real quick. There's a lot I want to talk about with the dream of Pilate's wife and so much, where he begins to say his attitude toward Jesus kind of changes there, but not necessarily for the right reasons and so forth. And it can be confusing as to look at what side is Satan on and which side is God on, because you want to think that God is on the side where Jesus gets to leave and go free, but I think it's the other way around. I think that dream came from Satan, and it was to try to get Pilate to let him go so he couldn't die for the sins of the world, right? Because Satan's not a fool. But in John 19, we see in verse 1, it says, Then Pilate therefore took Jesus and scourged him. Now, scourging is this terrible torture where they would take the prisoner and they would chain him to this block of wood in such a way where he had to be arched a little bit like this as he's chained. So his back is as exposed as it possibly could be. And they tear all the clothes off of him and fully expose the flesh of his back. And what they do is they take this device, it's a whip, and it's called the cat of nine tails. And what they do is they take the end of that whip and they'll tie sharp things to it, like nails or pieces of broken glass, things like that, to each of those 9 ends of the whip. And what they do is they will whip the person chained to that block. And as they whip them with that whip, those sharp things will dig themselves into the flesh of that person. And instead of just ripping it back out, what they do is they pull down. And those things, those sharp bits, they will make long gashes all the way down the back of the person being tortured. And a scourging is 39 lashes. So they whip that thing into his back and make long, hard cuts down his back 39 times before he's even made it to the cross. So he's scourged. And then it said, and the soldiers platted a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put on a purple robe and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they smote him with their hands. So, and now they're probably just punching him. But what happened is, when it says a crown of thorns, this isn't like thorns from, your mom's rose bush out front of your house. These are thorns about that long. They're very long, very sharp, very painful. They made a crown out of it. Normally you make a flower crown. Maybe you've heard of a flower crown. This was a crown of thorns, and it was meant to be a mockery, and it was meant to be painful, because they put it on his head. In another portions of scripture, it says that they beat it into his head using rods that they picked up, and they would hammer that crown of thorns into his skull with that rod. They put a robe of purple on his back. You want to know why they do that? You ever had like an open, exposed wound? I had one time. You can see the scar from it. We were working with chicken wire at Gospel Light Baptist Church, because I had no say in the matter. Because somebody said, "Hey, let's make an aquarium out of chicken wire." And I said, "Bad idea. I'm from the country. I know that's a bad idea. You city folk have never worked with chicken wire before. If it gets loose, somebody's going to lose an eyeball or something. Bad idea." And they were like, "Nah, it's fine." Okay. So luckily nobody got hurt all week long. Now we're working on taking it down. And by we, I mean me and Kyle and maybe Amanda, but she was pretty pregnant at the time. So I don't know if we let her help as much as she wanted to. But as I'm taking this chicken wire down, it pops and it takes a chunk. It doesn't cut me. It takes a chunk out of my finger. I've got open meat exposed in my finger, and it hurt like the devil. Now, also at this time, I'm very poor, so I don't have a lot of money, so I'm not going to the hospital, right? So what we did was we pinched it shut, and we took some medical, I don't know, it's not medical tape, but it was like a mesh. Maybe it was gauze. And I pinched it shut, and I wrapped it as tight as I could around it, and then we sealed it off. We like closed it off really good with some medical tape or something, and it was like that. Well, what I didn't realize was we didn't quite do it tight enough, and the wound had opened back up. So a few hours later, when I went to go check on it, it wouldn't come off, because the gauze had become to graft itself into the meat of my finger. So what I had to do was rip the gauze out of my finger meat. No pain I have ever felt like that. Was the most painful thing. Now that's one on my finger, and I cannot tell you how bad that hurt. Jesus has 39 times 9 cuts along his back that they just put a purple robe right on top of. And you know what they're going to do when they crucify him? They're going to take it off. So you don't realize how painful that purple robe is actually going to be. And then, of course, more physical beatings. Just punching him. He's gone from, beating with the bottom of their hands, and they're sort of just kind of hitting him, but trying not to leave bruises, being slapped, having the hairs pulled out of his beard, and now they're just punching him. Every form of physical pain a person could receive, he is getting all at once. I'm very quickly, Matthew 27. You guys are not listening fast enough this morning. I'm just so disappointed. Matthew 27, and in verse 32, we see the cross. He's finally to the cross. It says, and they came out and they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. Him they compelled to bear his cross. I do just want to say, based on the geography of this man and where he was from, they believe him to be a black man. And I want to point that out because it was a black man that helped Jesus carry his cross. Right? We want to talk about, racism. Racism is wrong. And never in the Bible does it mention it matters what a person's color of their skin is, or where they were born or where their people are from, because it was most likely a black man that helped Jesus carry his cross. And I felt I would do it injustice to not mention that as we came to it in the Bible. But in verse 33, it says, when they were come unto a place called Golgotha, that is to say a place of a skull, that was where Calvary was. And that's where the cross was to be set into the ground. It says, they gave him vinegar to drink mingled with gall, and when he had tasted thereof, he would not drink. This is not just because it tasted bad. The vinegar and the gall were used as an anesthesia for those about to endure the cross. It sort of helped numb the pain. Jesus refused it so that he could take the full effect of the cross and thus take the full penalty of sin. He didn't want the help. He wanted to take the full pain of crucifixion after the scourging and everything else he'd already been through. But you might be interested to know that the cross was approximately 9 feet tall. It was 6 feet long, and it weighed about 300 pounds. And the part I'm not sure that we read was he had to carry his cross from one side of the town all the way to the other, up the hill to the place where he was going to die on it. That was what crucifixion was. Let's jump over now to Luke 23. Luke 23 and verse 33. It says, and when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him, and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. Then Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So this is the point where they're preparing them to die on the cross. So they're untying them from the cross. They're laying these people on the cross, and then they're taking the nails, and they're driving the nails through the hands and the feet of the people into the wood and hanging them on the cross, setting the cross into the ground for them to die. The nails used to hang Jesus on the cross were tapered iron spikes. They were approximately 5 to 7 inches long, with a square shaft 3/8 inch or 1 centimeter across. These weren't, finishing nails that they put him on the cross with. These were big iron spikes that they were putting through his hands and through his feet. Even in the most excruciating pain a person can endure, though, Jesus is asking for forgiveness and showing compassion toward those that crucified him. And it makes the bitterness and the anger we're holding on to feel a little petty, doesn't it? You'd say, you don't know what he did to me. Did he put an iron spike through your wrist? I don't think that he or she did. Did they put you on a cross? Torture you? No, I don't think they did. Whatever they did to us, most likely Jesus went through worse. And if he can forgive, then we should try to forgive as well. That's the creed of our faith, is forgiveness. That's one of the things that marks it above all other things, is forgiveness. Because it's incredible that a man on death row can find forgiveness in Jesus. We don't understand that, but it's because we don't understand it that it's so incredible. It's so amazing and so powerful. If any man be in Christ, he's a new creature. When a person gets saved, he's no longer the same person he was. The same person that committed those sins and atrocities. There's a transformation that takes place in salvation. It's a beautiful thing. But he's also up there with the thief on the cross. And the repentant thief was told that he would be with him in paradise. And I just want to point out to you that he didn't have time to get baptized. He didn't have time to join a church. He didn't have time to let his good outweigh his bad. This man didn't have time to go follow the 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church. And yet this man was guaranteed heaven. For one reason and one reason only. And the Church of Christ drives you crazy when you bring this up. And the Catholic Church drives them crazy when you bring this up. But this man was on his way to heaven for one reason and one reason only. And it's by grace through faith, and that not of ourselves. There was nothing he could do for himself up on that cross except believe in Jesus, and that got him to heaven. Also, there are some people who are confused as to what happened to Jesus immediately after he died. Did he go to heaven and take the keys of death and hell from the devil there in heaven and then take them up to God? Because that's what some people teach, and it is wrong for so many different reasons. I can't even begin to, first of all, that's not where the devil is. He's not in hell. He's walking about seeking whom he may devour, right? Roaring lion. Jesus told us that. He's not in hell. He's amongst us this morning. Secondly, Jesus went to paradise. This day thou shalt be with me in paradise. Jesus went immediately to heaven. Obtaining the keys of death and hell, that's symbolism. In the same way that it's symbolism to say that he defeated death, that Jesus killed death. Death is a concept, right? You can't actually kill it. It's not an actual living thing. But the concept being that one day things dying won't be a thing anymore. Stuff's going to stop dying, and we're just all going to live forever with Jesus. Right? That's what he's trying to teach us about. But this thief on the cross, he teaches us so much about the nature of salvation. And it's important to mention. Jesus takes vinegar, this time with no gall. So this was not meant to be an anesthesia, just cruelty. So the second time they offer it to him, they give him the vinegar. He drinks the vinegar, but it's just vinegar. There's no gall to make the pain numbed at all. And then I want to close with this thought. Jesus says many things. I have a sermon on the many phrases Jesus said from the cross. And the last thing he says is this word, tetelestai. Tetelestai is a Hebrew word, and it means it is finished. But it's used in so many different contexts within culture. Firstly, it was used for the acceptance of the Passover lamb by the high priest. Tetelestai meant that it's an acceptable offering. This Passover feast is accepted, and it can now be used as the Passover lamb. Jesus saying, Tetelestai, I am the Passover lamb. I am also the high priest, and the sacrifice is being accepted, and salvation is offered to the world. That Passover lamb is just a picture. He says, I am the Tetelestai. This word was stamped on the bill of men who were imprisoned for debts they could not pay. But once they had paid off their debts, they were freed from prison. And this word was stamped on their bill, and it meant paid in full. And Jesus, when he was crucified, they hung over his head the reason for his crucifixion and his crime for being crucified, which said King of the Jews. And that's why he was there. But if they really put the list of reasons he was being crucified on that cross, it would have the sins of each and every one of us on that thing on the cross. And if they were to understand the full weight of why Jesus was on the cross, they would have taken that big stamp and they would have stamped above that sign on the cross that word tetelestai, so that we could know that our sins are paid in full. It's also after victory in battle, a runner would run toward town saying this phrase, tetelestai, as he ran through town, which meant that the enemy had been defeated and cannot rise again. Jesus saying that getting to this cross and dying for your sins, it gives you victory over Satan in a way that he has not known since Genesis 3. The moment sin entered the world, we had what's called a proto-evangelium, which is a fancy word for a promise God gave, that this sin that just entered planet Earth and entered the souls of mankind, it will be dealt with. There is a Savior coming. There is a hero coming to save you from this thing. And we see it here in Matthew 27. Tetelestai. The enemy has been defeated. The heel has crushed the head of the serpent, and he cannot rise again. That is our lesson for this morning. I am late by how many minutes, Josh?
It is 11 o'clock.
Oh. All right. So we'll be back at 11:15 for the Sunday morning service. And I'll have a shorter sermon, evidently.
Yeah.
there's gonna be a lot to go over.
Maybe it's